be very helpful. So, all right, welcome to the first Sunday of Advent. It's so good to see all of you. Happy belated Thanksgiving to all of you. I hope you had a wonderful, wonderful week eating entirely too much food, and hopefully you are recovering from that, as I know I am. Let's begin by, let me ask you, have you ever heard the saying, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen"? It's actually a saying that originates in the Bible, in 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is when David is lamenting the death of King Saul and Jonathan, and it actually means exactly how it sounds. It's a phrase that drips with irony, wondering how someone or something that was so mighty, so big, so powerful, so just on top of the world, fell all of a sudden so drastically, so just kind of out of nowhere, right? And yet they fall, and their demise is quite quick and surprising. The reason why I mention this to you is because in many ways, I think this phrase encapsulates what's happening here in Genesis chapter 20, doesn't it? Think about it. In the previous section, if you're here last week in chapter 18 and 19, we find Abraham doing extraordinary things. If you remember, he's told that God is going to destroy a nation because they're exceedingly wicked. And what does he do? He pleads, more even negotiates with God and gets God to agree to have mercy upon a nation that he was originally going to destroy. And why does Abraham do this? We mentioned it's because he is exemplifying the very nature and character of our God, the only God and the only one that gives mercy and grace to the wicked, undeserved sinners of the world like you and me. Abraham is in many ways, he's literally being of God's character to these people. He has reached heights that I think we all might dream of, and yet in chapter 20, as Jason read for us, he falls in ways that we probably didn't think he would fall. He, again, if you remember chapter 12, again finds himself in a foreign land, lying to a foreign king about Sarah not being his wife, but rather his sister, only to have her taken by said foreign king, and then having to have God come in, rescue all of them from their sin and stupidity. You'd think that after chapter 12 that Abram would have learned his lesson, but no. Here we find him repeating a very, very wicked and grave sin, and might I say, worse than before. So then we must ask, how does something like this even happen? Did you find yourself being frustrated at Abraham, being like, yo, Abraham, bro, seriously? How does one go from such spiritual heights to this? And perhaps maybe even more important that we must ask, if Abraham, the father of faith, can go from such heights to this, then what does that mean for good old you and me? How does this even happen? What does this mean, right? Well, these questions and more, I think, are going to be unpacked, and I think you're going to see something very interesting happen. But before we get there, let's go through this story really quickly and do a quick little summary, shall we? Abram is on the move again. For whatever reason, we're not told. And when he does, he journeys back towards the south. If you remember, this is before he goes to Egypt and comes back towards the Negev. It's just a reference. He went outside the promised land in chapter 12, but here he's at the south border, the southern border of the promised land, and here's a little bit of a closer look. That's where he is, in Gerar, at the bottom of the southern part of Canaan. But as a foreigner, still as a sojourner, Abraham is required to take note and clarify or declare who is a part of his family. And so then he tells the men of Gerar that Sarah is his sister. And as a result, the men of Gerar take her and then give her to the king, Abimelech in this case. Now, this time around, what's interesting, and again, I'm going to do some compare and contrast between chapter 12 and chapter 20 because those are very interesting and very important to understand this passage. But what's interesting here is that in chapter 12, if you remember, we're told that the reason why she's taken is because she's very beautiful. But here, there's no mention of any of these things. There's no reason why she's taken. She's just taken. Now, what this suggests isn't maybe what you think. It doesn't mean that because now Sarah is 90 years old, all of a sudden she's not beautiful anymore, as we might expect in our culture, right? We think being old means being not so pretty. Not true. That's not what the Bible is mentioning at all. But what's important to note is that that's not really an important factor here. That's really all you have to know. The reasons why Sarah was taken is not really what's important. There's something else that God is trying to get to. And so anyways, Sarah is taken. And what does God do? Well, then God immediately intervenes. He shows up to Abimelech and he says, hey, Abimelech, in a dream, behold, and this is crazy, you're a dead man, bro. You know why? Because you done took somebody else's wife. God is super forceful. He is like in his face, and he's like, you better do exactly as I tell you to do. And so what does Abimelech do? He pleads with God. He's like, oh, wait, God. Are you seriously going to slay a nation even though we are blameless? God, don't you realize that didn't he tell you? I mean, don't you realize that he said that she's my sister, and even she said that he's my brother? Like, I had no idea. How was I supposed to know that he was actually married to her? I swear to you, God, I didn't know, and because I didn't know, I'm actually innocent. At least I did it innocently. And then, somewhat surprisingly, at least to me, God affirms all this and says, no, you're right, Abimelech. You actually didn't know, and therefore you, in your innocent of heart, integrity of heart, you have done this action. But, don't forget, you still have to restore her. Why? He's a prophet, and he's going to pray for you, and you're going to live. And if you don't, you're going to surely die. So then, Abimelech does a lot. First, he tells all of his servants, right, that know the situation. Hey, this is what's happening, and we're told that they're greatly frightened. And then he returns, right? He returns Sarah to Abraham. But when he does, he asks him very simply, hey, what have you done to us? What do we do to you, actually, that you would do this thing? This stuff like this is not supposed to happen between you and I. What in the world is going on? And what's Abraham's response? He gives essentially 3 reasons. I didn't think y'all had fear of God in this place. Actually, she's my sister, and from the very beginning, we made this pact that wherever we go, she's going to say that I'm her brother and that she is my sister, so that indeed we'll be safe. Note, in chapter 12, when Abraham is asked why he did such a thing, we're not told he says anything. He's mum and silent. And yet here, we are told that he did a lot, right? He says quite a bit, which will be interesting. We'll unpack that later. Well, we find that Abraham's answers are really nothing but excuses, which is interesting. But yet, Abimelech restores Sarah. But not only that, he gives sheep and oxen, male and female servants, kind of like chapter 12. But then he also says, behold, my land is before you, settle wherever you like, which is significant. He's offering citizenship to a constant sojourner, a foreigner. He's saying, hey, here's my land, here's my legal rights. If you take this land and become one of ours, then you have all the rights that you don't have in this place. And then he also does this thing. He tells Sarah, kind of sounds like a dig at Abraham, but he goes, hey, by the way, I gave your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. That's notable because what's happening here is that in those days, the legal limit of how much you could pay for someone's daughter's hand in marriage was 50 shekels. So here's Abimelech paying back 20 times the quote-unquote sin that he committed. And then, just as God told Abimelech, Abraham, we find out, prays for Abimelech. The women are healed, their wombs are opened, and then they bear children. And then the story ends. Now that we have the summary, let's readdress the question from earlier. How does this even happen? Well, there's 2 reasons. I'll give you the first one, and the second one is more important. But it's actually a little more interesting than I think you will realize. The first reason how this has happened is simply because Abraham has fallen captive and prey to what has been called an old sin. A pastor named Kent Hughes defines an old sin this way. He says it's a particular sin, a particular fear, a particular temptation that you and I, we are all uniquely susceptible to. An old sin is a particular sin, particular fear, a particular temptation that you and I are uniquely susceptible to, that we are weak against, that we are powerless against. It's what many in our culture might call a vice. Now let me define for you what a vice is in a way that might hopefully be a little bit comical but also helpful. I have a vice, but don't worry, it's not that big of a vice, at least in my opinion. I have a vice, aka a weakness towards something that I love dearly that is not good for me, called a chocolate chip cookie. I love me some chocolate chip cookies, okay? Now, I'm fully aware, all of you are fully aware, that although it tastes great, it's not good for you. It is not healthy. It does not help me have the kind of body that I want. It's not going to be helpful for me as I age and get older and doing all the things that I want. It is not good for me, and yet I cannot almost always say no to a chocolate chip cookie. It does not matter. Why? Because I have a weakness. I got a problem. Here's how deep this problem goes. Anytime I find out that there's a chocolate chip cookie shop anywhere within my vicinity, aka 15 to 20 miles from my house, I will go immediately to that chocolate chip cookie place and order me a chocolate chip cookie to see if indeed they have a good one. Generally, I find that they're not very good, or at least not to my liking. By the way, if you're interested, my favorite in the entire city of Houston is still Pudgy's Fine Cookies. It's in the Heights. Thankfully for me, it's a little too far. It's outside that 15 to 20 mile radius, so I don't go there very often. But when I do, trust me, I buy too many cookies for my own good. But I've also tried every single chocolate chip cookie joint in my area in Katy. To name a few, I've tried chip cookies, crave cookies, whoopie cookies, and many others that you don't want to know about because they all go out of business too soon because their cookies are no good. But the other reason, thankfully, that I'm thankful for is that most of these places aren't too good, and then also they charge too much for their cookies. They're usually like $5 a cookie, which I think is ridiculous. And so being Korean and being kind of that you got to get your money's worth person, I don't actually go back. But this is not also all that helpful because there are cheaper options for cookies that, in my opinion, are tastier. Just to give you, if you are like me and love yourself a good chocolate chip cookie, go to Costco. $2, but it's 900 calories, so do to your own. If that's too much for you, then in my opinion, another good option is go to Paris Baguette, as we like to call it in Korean, or Paris Baguette. That's not what it is, Paris Baguette. Go get their chocolate chip cookie. Their triple chocolate chip cookie is $3.25, pretty good. If that is too expensive for you, then go to Buc-ee's. They sell a 6-pack for $5, and if you warm them up in the air fryer, so good. As I said, I have a bit of a problem. And my love for chocolate chip cookies is, it certainly fits the bill of what I call a vice. Now that you kind of understand what a vice is, now let me explain to you a little bit more about vices, a few things. First, there are degrees to this thing called a vice. My vice, I think, is a minor one, okay? It is bad, but it's not life-disruptive. My life isn't ending because of chocolate chip cookies, thankfully, right? It's not that serious. They're problematic, but again, not that serious. But there are others that are indeed quite serious. I don't have to mention them all to you. I think we all have them if we're just being honest. But let's just talk about Abraham's. Abraham has a vice. He has an old sin. And in this case, it's causing him a ton of problems. You see, the lower degree ones, we may say, I have a weakness for chocolate chip cookies, for example. But the major vices are such that we would say they're moral deficiencies. They're truly problematic in life. And indeed, we can see that in Abraham. So that's the first thing. But the second thing we must know about old sin, or aka vices, is that they are almost always unique to each and every individual. What this means is that an old sin, a vice to one person, is often nothing to another. Some of you in here be like, I don't care about chocolate chip cookies, and so I was going on and raving about chocolate chip cookies, and it didn't matter to you at all. You didn't care. I don't like chocolate chip cookies. I like, I don't know, name it. Christina likes chips and fries, right? Whatever the thing might be. So vices and old sins are such that though one may cause someone to trip up or fall altogether, to another, it won't even register on the radar. And yet, if we're all willing to admit, I'm pretty confident every single one of us has a vice or two, one in the lesser, weakness category and one in the more moral deficient category, if we're really being honest. And the third thing we must know about vices is that because every single person has them, the most shocking thing about old sins and vices is that it does not matter at all. Let me repeat, it does not matter at all who you are. Your old sin or your vice will trip you up almost every single time if you're not careful. You see, an old sin and a vice is such that no matter who you are, no matter how accomplished you are, how wise you are, how powerful you are, right, how successful you may be, the old sin, aka vice, is the thing to which you will trip up almost every single time. Why? You are powerless to it, and it's your own unique old sin. This is why we find Abraham falling again to this very same issue. If you notice, he repeats the same reasoning in both. In chapter 12, he says, hey, Sarah, you're really beautiful. So when they find you, they're going to kill me and take you because that's what they do around these parts. Well, here he says basically the same thing. You didn't have fear of God in this place, so you're going to take my wife and kill me. What we find is that with Abraham, the old sin is this thing where the possibility of his failure, his harm, and even then his death, well then when faced with that push comes to shove, he is always going to fall to this old sin. We know this is so strong because we're actually told how powerless he is to this very thing. That from the beginning, he makes an agreement, a pact with Sarah, if you will, and he says basically, hey, whenever we go anywhere, you're going to tell the people, he's my brother. From the jump, we find that Abraham had always had a backup plan, or better, a just-in-case plan. A just-in-case plan to make sure that if God, for whatever reason, isn't somehow faithful, I, Abraham, can ensure that I will live. And I think, again, if we're being honest, all of us have some sort of fail-proof, fail-safe, just-in-case plan to make sure that our lives go the way that we want it to if we don't feel like God is helping us to get there. Now, having said that, then if you look at Abraham's response to Abimelech in its totality, you see the depths of how far this old sin and this just-in-case plan goes. And remember, in chapter 12, he says almost nothing in response to Pharaoh's question. But here, he has quite a bit to say, and it's a lot. Abimelech asked Abraham, hey, what sin have I committed against you that you have brought such a great sin upon me? We'll touch this more a little later, but Abimelech here is giving Abraham so much grace and credit that he does not deserve. Abimelech is saying, hey, you know what, Abraham? Surely I must have done something to you that would have then caused you to do this wicked and terrible thing that no one ought to do to anyone, and yet you did it. So what could I possibly have done to you that you would have done this to me? That's grace. But Abraham, deep in his old sin, he don't care. He's not hearing. He's just going to respond how he's going to respond. And how does he respond? By giving excuse after excuse after excuse. This is the whole section. He goes, first, I assume that because y'all are pagans, and you know pagans are not so good people, that y'all don't have a fear of God in this place at all, and surely you're going to kill me in order to take my wife. You know what's ironic and interesting? What was Abraham doing in the previous section in chapter 18? When he found out that the exceedingly wicked city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we saw, if you were here last week, how exceedingly wicked they were. When he found out that they were going to get destroyed, what does he do? He assumes, he hopes, he postures himself in hoping that just maybe, there were 50 righteous people in that city, that God would then spare them. But yet, when he comes to Gerar, he can't assume that there's even one. All of a sudden, they're totally wretched people that are just going to kill him for his wife? And the second excuse he gives, he goes, oh, well, but besides, she's actually my sister. We have the same father, just have different mothers. And she kind of became my wife. Almost kind of like that. Like, what? How does someone just become your wife? That's not how this works. But Abraham is basically saying, hey, I didn't technically lie to you, dude. But even if you give Abraham every benefit of the doubt that's possible, he still conveniently left out the whole truth, that this is my wife. And it's surprising if you think about what happened again in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, God affirms to him as clear as day, by the way, you and Sarah are going to be father and mother of the true son, Isaac. And yet right after that, he's like, no, she's not my wife. And the third excuse, the worst of them all. He goes, and it came about when God caused me to wander from my house that I said to her, this is the kindness which will show me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Whew. Did you notice first? He deflects and worse, blames God for all of his troubles. What he's saying is basically, if God had not caused me to wander from my homeland, I wouldn't be in this place where I got to tell people that you're my sister. Because in my homeland, everyone's going to know. No one's going to try to steal you from me in my homeland, but here, as a sojourner, as a foreigner, as an alien, I got to always defend myself and make sure I don't get killed, and so I got to do this thing. It's actually God's fault that I have to do this thing wherever I go. But even worse, to add insult to injury, if you will, he goes, and so Sarah, here's what you're going to do for me. Whenever we go to a new place, you're going to tell them, as a kindness to me, that I'm your brother. But if you notice kind of the way things go in this conversation, the question we have to wonder is, does Sarah even have a choice in this matter? In a very patriarchal land where men have all the power, do you really think Sarah could have been like, I'm sorry, Abraham, I don't agree to this. I don't think it's a good plan. Can we think of something else? That's not how this works. He basically goes, so God, it's your fault that I have to wander, and it's your fault, therefore I got to lie. And when we get there, Sarah, you're going to lie for me because indeed, that's how we're going to keep alive. But if you remember from chapter 12, do you remember how deep his heart goes? His reasoning for this lie or this pact is very simple. He's saying, you know what's going to happen when we go to these new cities? They're going to want to take you. It's what people do. It's what the men of these nations do. But if they take you and we tell them that you're my wife, then they're going to kill me, so I'm going to die. So I have a better idea. Why don't you lie to them so that you live and I live? Now, that may sound like a good idea on the surface, but it's actually not, because what's happening? Sarah gets taken into a harem to basically be a sex slave for the king for the rest of her life. But hey, you know what? That's a good compromise, because at least you'll live and I'll live. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. I mean, the irony is crazy, is it not? So then let me ask you again, how does this happen? Where do we go from here? Because again, the implications are pretty clear, isn't it? If Abraham can fall like this, then just about anyone, surely you and I can fall like this, right? So where do we go from here? Where do we go from an episode that seems so dreary and grim? How do we handle the heights that Abraham was at and then the lows that he's at, and how do we understand this? How does one fall? How does this even happen? Well, the second answer, the reason number one, if you remember, is because of old sin. The second reason is because this is for the glory of God. That's why Abraham falls. Now here's why. Let's break this down. I think for many of us, because we're very well accomplished, sometimes when we read stories like this, we just get really frustrated. I don't know if you were like that. I was talking to it with Christina, and she immediately goes, how does Abraham do that? Like, what in the world? And you could feel, and again, I'm right with it, you could feel like the frustration, like, what in the world? Like, bro, seriously, get your life together kind of idea. And generally our response to that is what? I'm not going to be like him. I'm going to do better. Because we're all good, upstanding people, are we not? But I think to do that would be to miss the point. I think the thing that's happening here is that we must lean into the ridiculous irony and the tension of this passage as it indeed is confronted to us. And here's why. The reason why Abraham falls and how does this thing how do things like this happen is because in it is where we best see the glory and grace of God. In Abraham's old sin, we best see the glory and grace of God. The truth of the gospel, church, is this, that the beauty of the gospel is most seen in the irony of the gospel. Or better, the beauty of the gospel is best seen in the tension of the gospel. Why? Because you see God's grace most and best in the depth and depravity of our sin. Where do you see the glory of God's grace most? In the deepest depths and wickedness of our sin. And so as you see Abraham literally falling from the heights that he used to be at, that God had taken him to, when we see the gospel shining ever brighter. Again, let me explain. As you read the passage, like I said, the thing that's most interesting to me about the passage is the irony in the passage. Let me highlight a few. The first one happens to be with Abimelech. Did you find it ironic that Abimelech sounds like the better dude in this story? First, if you took a person who has never read the Bible, has never heard a Bible story, didn't know who Abraham was, and so on and so forth, and you said, hey, read this story. And then you ask that person, hey, tell me who you think is the person that most reflects the God in the story, right? I think almost everybody would be like, duh, Abimelech. Because Abraham sounds like a class A D-bag, if you know? Like, he's just not a good dude in this story. It's just bad. And actually, once you dig in, you would say, oh, no, Abimelech for sure is the better dude in this story. Let me illustrate, okay? Let me tell you. Although Abraham's the father of faith, the chosen one in and through which the salvation of the world is to come, it is actually Abimelech who plays that part way better than Abraham. Abimelech takes Sarah. Why? Because it's a custom of the day, believing wholeheartedly in his heart that she is Abraham's sister, and so he is legally doing what he is allowed to do. And as we said, God affirms that he did not have an idea, and indeed in the integrity of his heart, he didn't do it maliciously. He didn't intend to commit such a sin as taking someone else's wife. But next, we also find that Abimelech actually never touched Sarah, never actually committed any adultery or sin against Abraham and Sarah, therefore. But even more surprising, even though he's innocent of such things, did you see what Abimelech does once he's confronted with the sin? He takes ownership of it. Also, he pleads for his nation. He goes, God, are you really going to kill an entire nation even though they're blameless? The irony in this is that what did we find Abraham doing in a chapter ago? He's going, hey, are you really going to kill an entire nation if you're able to have 50 righteous? We see Abimelech doing almost exactly the same thing to this God that he does not know. Remember, he's pagan. But even then, Abimelech kind of takes things to a whole nother level. Even though he unknowingly sinned, aka was not his intention, therefore is not his part, he takes ownership. And what does he do? He then pays back way more than he should have. He gives oxen and sheep and servants and so on and so forth. And then he also gives citizenship, which he didn't have to do. And then on top of that, he pays 20 times the amount of what is required for, quote unquote, said sin. And then, even most surprising to me, when he gives Abraham the chance to answer for himself, giving him so much more benefit of the doubt than Abraham ever deserved, and Abraham, all he does is give him excuse after excuse, what does he do? He doesn't get mad. He doesn't get angry. He just takes it. And actually, not only does he take it, he still owns to his own sin, and then he repays for his sin. We find a pagan Canaanite king acting so much more righteous and godly, if you will, than Abraham, the father of our faith. But here's why. Is because the whole point of this passage isn't for us to get frustrated at Abraham's sin, isn't for us to be like, man, how does someone do such a thing? It reminds me of like how parents can be, I'm a parent too, where you think like good things of your kids, or as you should, and then all of a sudden they do something terrible, and then the first thing is like, how in the world could you do that? Like, we're just so disappointed that they, who you thought were great, could do such a stupid thing. That's kind of where we sit. And then again, what we do is react and we say, we're just not going to be like that. We're going to be better. But that's not the point. The point of this passage isn't to focus on Abraham's old sin. The point of the passage isn't to be frustrated at Abraham. The point of the passage isn't to lament how Abraham can be so stupid, all those things. The point of the passage is to see the gospel of our God, the grace of our God, shine in ways you probably didn't think it would in a situation like this. Here's how. Interestingly, if you compare chapter 12 and chapter 20, you'll find perhaps the biggest difference is that in chapter 12, there's literally only one mention of God. In chapter 12, in verse 7, we're told that God struck Pharaoh and his house with the plagues, and that's it. The entire narrative is actually focused on other external factors, aka Sarah's beauty, the famine that's in the land of Canaan that causes Abraham to go down to Egypt in the first place. Pharaoh's anger and his forceful expulsion of Abraham out of the land. Those are all the things that get highlighted in this section. But here, that's actually not what we get. Abraham almost does nothing. He just sins a lot. He opens his big mouth and does all that. But more so, what you find is God is a central figure in this story through and through. And what God does is actually mind-blowing if you think about it. Again, Abraham shows up in this new city. He's got the plan that he's had with Sarah from the very jump. And so he tells the men, hey, by the way, this is my sister. Knowing that saying that is going to get her taken. Knowing that he's now turning his back on the promise. Knowing that he's throwing his wife under the bus. All that sort of stuff that we all know. Remember, this is before the son arrives. This is within that 1 year span when God tells him, hey, you're going to have a son in a year. And then it's right in there. But what does God do? As soon as Abraham sins, knowing that he's going to sin some more later when he opens his big mouth, what does God do? He comes to Abimelech in a dream. And what does he say to him? Hey, Abimelech, listen up, because if you don't, you're a dead man. Those words, by the way, are not echoed, I don't think, ever again in Scripture. God is rarely this forceful in this kind of a way, but he is clear. You a dead man. You sinned. You done took someone else's wife, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to return her, and you're going to restore everything. You're going to do exactly as I tell you, because if you don't, you are surely a dead man. The threat cannot be mistaken. This is not nice talk. But did you also notice other things, what God was doing? He goes, no. When Abimelech goes, hey, by the way, God, I didn't sin on purpose. I didn't know what I was doing. Did you see what God said? No, I'm with you. You didn't actually do that. Is this a passage? Did I get it right? Yeah. You didn't. This is in the integrity of your thing. This is what you did. But the only reason you didn't touch that woman is because I prevented you from touching that woman. AKA, if I had not prevented you, you would have done the thing you would have done. It's suggested later in the passage in verse 17 and 18. Did you notice? That God might have most likely struck Abimelech and the women of that town with a sickness to basically prevent Abimelech from doing anything. From the jump, you see God is more interested, more faithful, more protective of the promise that he made than anyone else is. The grace is just everywhere. God didn't have to do that. But last, did you notice the thing that's the most mind-boggling of it all? In verse 7, do I have this up here? No, I don't. In verse 7, this is what he says. He goes, now Abimelech, therefore, restore the man's wife. Do you remember why? For he is a prophet, and he is going to pray for you, and you, because he prays, will live. And here's the crazy thing. This is the first ever instance of the word prophet in all of the Bible. First, ever. And the irony is this. If you and I were God, or I'll just put this in. If I was God, I would have called Abraham a prophet in chapter 18. Because he does very prophet-like things. He prays for a wicked nation. He prays on behalf of them. He acts very prophetically and helps to restore and at least give Sodom and Gomorrah a chance, doing all these amazing things. If you and I were like him, if you and I were God, we would have elevated God or elevated Abraham in that instance, but that's not what God does at all. After Abraham sinks deep into his old sin, before he's about to do worse by opening his mouth, blaming Sarah, blaming God, and doing all of this stuff, then God elevates Abraham to a place he had never been before. Did you notice? In the face of Abraham's old sin, God does not blame Abraham. He doesn't shame Abraham. He doesn't even speak any ill of Abraham. He elevates him. He gives him an identity he's never, ever had before. One that has never been given to anybody yet in all of human history. He gives him the identity and the role. And saying, you, even though you don't deserve it at all, and make no mistake, he absolutely does not deserve this decision. You are going to be partly responsible for the restoration, redemption, and healing of this land. Why? Because I am a gracious God. And my grace covers most when you are most sinful. And crazy enough, Abraham doesn't repent. We're not told any of those things. What happens? He prays. And then they're healed. And how fitting. If you've been here throughout this entire series, you'll know, maybe you won't, that the title of the series is what? Called for Blessing. The entire idea of this entire series through Abraham is to know that Abraham was called so that he can be blessed in order to be a blessing unto others. It's the reason why God tells him, hey, I'm about to destroy this land called Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because if the nations are going to be blessed through you, I got to let you know if I'm going to eliminate one of those nations. So through and through, what God is doing is making sure that though Abraham is never really up to the task on his own, God is going to make sure that he will be blessed in order that others will be blessed through him. It's nuts. I mean, just let it really sink in. How do you know that God is gracious? You'll know best when you know and you have zero qualms. You are 100% clear that you're not deserving of it. Again, I've made examples like this in the past. How do you know when a parent loves their kid? Again, if you're willing to suck a booger out of your kid's nose, that love is real, bro. Right? Only the parents and you're like, mm-hmm. And then they immediately look at the kid like, I did that for you. How do you know when your partner, your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, girl, whoever, really, really loves you? When you're acting great and you look great and all that kind of stuff? Again, I was at a wedding last night. Beautiful. Bride, beautiful. Like just elegant, like all of it. But that's not when I know that her husband loves her most. It's in premarital counseling. It's in other places when she's not the most beautiful person on the planet, dressed in all white with all of her everything. It's when you are at your worst and your husband or your wife still chooses to love you and be gracious to you. That's when you're like, yeah, that one's the real one. In their vows yesterday, you know what they said? This is actually an interesting, I can give this. Michelle and Anthony were the ones that got married yesterday. They got married actually a little over a year ago, like legally. I did their officiating here, and then this was their celebration because of whatever. But in their personal vows to each other, both of them very much stated this. They said, after I got married, I thought it was going to be like amazing, and then Michelle had this great line, and yet the first year was devastating. Because they lost very close people to them. But you know what they said? The way you supported me, loved me, with tears flowing, that's how I know that your vows mean everything. That's how you know. When you're doing great, you think you deserve the great things you get. Let's be honest, no? But when you get love, you don't deserve. When you get grace, you don't deserve. When you get compliments, you don't deserve. When you get things you don't deserve, that's when you really know that you're loved. And that's what we're seeing here. God gives Abraham grace at a time when he does not ever deserve it. If we're really being honest, I think in some sort of way, at least for me, I'm Korean, and so we say, like, we have this phrase, like, "속시원," like there's a thing that makes you feel like just better inside. It would have been a lot better, in my opinion, if God would have just been really angry and been like, oh, you. If God would have looked at Abraham like that no good, unfaithful, forgetful little, and then he said, like, curse you for forgetting, curse you for not trusting, curse you for literally turning your back on everything I've done for you. I think maybe we might have felt a little bit better. Why? Because that's kind of how we work. Because we don't like grace. Because grace tells you didn't deserve the things that you got. Grace tells you suck, and yet you got the things you didn't deserve. And yet, the glory of this passage is when Abraham is at his worst, God is gracious to him at his best. When he was at his worst, Abraham becomes a thing he never deserved, which is a prophet at his best. How does one fall like this? How does it even happen? For the glory of God, because that's how you know grace. So what do we learn then? I think we learn a couple things. First, don't mess with sin. Let me make that absolutely clear. Pray, Lord, what is my old sin? Protect me from my old sin. Help me not to fall again and again to it. Please, Lord, by your grace, by your Spirit, spare me from such trouble. Pray for your sin. But the second thing is, as you pray for your sin, always never get stuck there in the frustration of why you keep sinning over and over again, but then turn your eyes to the very grace of God and then remind yourself this truth that I think is the most important one for the day. The grace of our God is the only hope for sinners like you and me. Let me repeat that. The grace of our God is the only hope for sinners like you and me. Nothing else. We are who we are because of God's grace. We are who we are because of Him and only Him. The gospel is our only hope. Not one of the hopes, not a hope, the one and only hope without which we are nothing. Now, if you're like most people in the world, all of a sudden I just poured a whole bunch of burden upon you. Because we don't like that truth, if we're being honest. But here's how we receive it with grace. Is you and I, that we would pray, oh, that the mighty would fall. I call this the somebody syndrome. If you notice throughout Scripture, and this is where we finish, God only calls nobodies. Did you notice that? He calls nobodies. Everyone is a nobody. People that people discount, people that shouldn't have done this, shouldn't have had this, youngest son in David, right? Moses has a speech impediment, doesn't want to do the things that he wants to do, yada, yada, yada. All calls nobodies everywhere. If you remember, Abraham was literally the nobody. He was just a dude, a pagan, not even a God's people, and yet God called him. But you know what happens in life? Because we all are after, we want to reach great heights, and that's not a bad thing. But as soon as you get there, you know what happens? You get stuck with the somebody syndrome. You forget that the reason why you got there in the first place is because you're a nobody that God called, and then all of a sudden you think you're there because you're somebody. And then your biggest thing in your mind is a skill that you think you have as that somebody, and then you rely on that very skill for your entire life, forgetting entirely that God has called you in the first place. You know what this teaches us? Don't ever get this twisted, church. We as sinners are powerless against sin, period. Without God's grace, we're dead. We're a dead man, as he calls Abimelech. But if we choose to continually humble ourselves and accept our nobodiness, knowing that nothing that I am is because of me, that I'm not a somebody, I am a nobody being called by God, then you and I will actually pray, oh, how the mighty have fallen, and glory be to you, because that's the only way we can ensure that we will never get so high on our horse, that we'll never think that we are somebody, that we then forget about your grace. We then pray, may I fall so that you might cause me to rise. Maybe you even dare pray, Lord, show me the depth of my sin. Show me how deeply I can indeed fall. Sounds like a crazy prayer, but you don't find at the bottom of that pit, you'll find the blood of Christ, the grace of him never ending, who will indeed then push you up out of the pit and allow you to rise. May you pray, may I fall so that you might cause me to rise. May you pray, may I deny myself and take up my cross so that I might actually follow you. May you pray, may I die, God, to my sins so that you might actually live in me. And the last bit of irony in this whole thing is nuts. At the end, Abraham prays, and then we're told that God opens up the wombs of all the women in Gerar. But did you catch why? He says, because of who? Sarah, not Abraham. And what's interesting and what's ironic is this. In chapter 16, when Sarah goes kind of buck wild and she decides to take her own life into her own hands, what does she do? She says, God has caused my womb to close, and therefore I can't have no children. She blames God, just like Abraham did. And what happens right afterward? Next week, Pastor Chris is going to preach about when God opens Sarah's womb finally, and she laughs in joy at the comedy that her life is. Do you want to find? Because of Sarah, God says, all the women whose wombs had been closed by God are now opened, a.k.a. God continually uses the worst people to do the greatest things. Why? Because his grace always shines in the most depth of our sin. Embrace that and you have it all. Fail to embrace that and all you'll have is your somebody skill that won't amount to much except for more and more sin. May you receive the hope of the gospel this day, not a burden. That the reason why Jesus comes is because we can't save ourselves. The reason why he must come and become one of us is because we on our own, without God taking our place and therefore giving us his righteousness, we are powerless against this thing called sin. We're dead meat. But receive the gospel in its truth. That God saves wicked sinners. That his grace is shown most when we are most low. Then you'll pray, Lord, would you make me a nobody prophet? I don't want to be a somebody. I want to be a nobody so that you, God, can always be my somebody. May the hope of this season always be centered on our God. May you embrace your sin, not in the ways that you keep sinning, but in the ways that you realize it is because of sin that grace exists. And then may you always turn your eyes upon the Lord, who though we are sinful, his grace is always more. Glory be to him, for there is no one like him. And blessings to all of you, for indeed his grace, somehow, some way, is yours. May he, the one who opens all wombs to life, open your life to more and more of it. And may you give him glory because he is indeed good. Take some time and then reflect.